The cold winds howled through the towering pines of Crater Lake National Park, where snow blanketed the rugged wilderness like an unforgiving sheet of white. In the early days of February 1975, Charles McCullar, a 19-year-old photographer with a penchant for adventure, set out on a journey that would take him deep in this remote, inhospitable landscape. Armed with his camera, a heavy backpack, and an unshakable resolve, he was determined to capture the winter beauty of the park, despite warnings about the volatile weather and dangerous terrain. His friends had tried to dissuade him. "Come on, Charles. You know how unpredictable it can get out there. The snow's too deep this time of year," one had said. But Charles waved them off. He had always been one to chase after the untouched beauty of nature, and Crater Lake, with its steep cliffs and crystalline waters, was the perfect subject for his next series of photos. The morning he departed, Charles sent his parents a postcard from Oregon, telling them not to worry. He promised he'd be back soon, but soon would never come. Days passed, and no one heard from Charles. His family grew uneasy. When another week slid by with no word, they contacted the park rangers, who immediately launched a search. Volunteers, local guides, and even Charles's friends joined in, combing the area around Crater Lake, expecting to find him stuck in the snow or holed up in a makeshift camp. But they found nothing. For days they searched: footprints, a camera strap, anything that would suggest where Charles might have gone. Yet it was as if he had vanished into thin air. The deeper they ventured into the wilderness, the more ominous the landscape became, with its towering trees and jagged cliffs concealing whatever secrets they held. The official search was eventually called off, but Charles's family never stopped looking. The snow began to melt as the months rolled by, and the winter gave way to spring, but with it came only silence. Until, in the summer of 1976, a year after his disappearance, a startling discovery was made. Hikers in the park stumbled upon what appeared to be remnants of Charles' gear. His backpack, weathered and torn, was found near a dry creek bed, nestled between rocks as if carefully placed. Scattered nearby were some of his belongings: his camera, the film still inside, though badly damaged by exposure to the elements. But what they found next chilled them to the core. They discovered a pair of pants. These were not just any pants, but Charles' pants. They were lying neatly on the ground, with the belt still fastened. Strangely, they appeared to be in good condition despite the harsh winter they had endured. Yet, inside the pants were the skeletal remains of Charles's lower legs. It was as if his body had simply evaporated, leaving only his bones behind. His shoes were gone, and the upper part of his body was missing entirely, no trace of it ever found. The way the pants lay, undisturbed, made it seem like they had been carefully removed, or, more disturbingly, that whatever had happened to Charles had been so sudden that his body never had the chance to move. The discovery sent shockwaves through the park and the search team. Investigators were baffled. How could a body decompose so thoroughly in such a short time, especially in the cold, where decay is typically slowed? How did his bones end up in one place, his belongings another? Theories began to swirl. Some said it was exposure. Perhaps he succumbed to the elements, but why had no one found his body when the snow melted? Others suggested wild animals, but there was no sign of struggle or predation. The strangest detail of all, however, was the absence of any explanation for how Charles had reached this isolated spot. The location where his remains were found was far from the trails, in an area so remote and treacherous that even experienced hikers avoided it. There were no footprints, no evidence of a fall, and certainly no logical reason why a young man would wander so deep into the wilderness in the dead of winter. As rumors spread, so did the fear. Crater Lake had always been known for its eeriness. Locals spoke of strange lights hovering above the lake at night, of disembodied voices echoing through the trees. Some believed the area was cursed, haunted by spirits of the Native American tribes who once inhabited the region. Others whispered of more unnatural forces at work, beings not of this world, lurking in the dense forest, watching those who dared venture too far into their territory. Charles McCullar's disappearance and the macabre discovery of his remains only added fuel to these rumors. Over the years, stories began to circulate about people who had entered Crater Lake National Park, never to return. Some claimed to have heard strange humming noises in the middle of the night. Others swore they had seen shadowy figures moving just beyond the tree line. But there were no answers, only questions, and the gnawing sense that something far more sinister was at play in the deep wilderness of Crater Lake. As time passed, Charles's family was forced to accept the grim reality that they would never know what happened to their son. The park officials, eager to put the mystery behind them, concluded their investigation with little fanfare, attributing the disappearance to the harsh conditions of the wilderness. But for those who had been involved in the search, the case of Charles McCullar was anything but closed. One park ranger, who had been part of the initial search team, couldn't let it go. He had scoured the area himself, walking the same trails Charles might have taken, but something always felt wrong. The ranger had worked the park for decades, and he knew it like the back of his hand, but something about this case gnawed at him. Years after the official search ended, the ranger returned to the area where Charles's remains had been found, determined to see if he had missed anything. Alone in the woods, he walked for hours, the landscape eerily silent around him. The deeper he went, the more unsettling the forest became. Shadows seemed to shift behind the trees, and the air grew heavy with an unspoken tension. As he reached the dry creek bed where Charles' belongings had been found, a sense of dread washed over him. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end as if he were being watched. But there was no one around, just the trees and the distant sound of the wind. He knelt down to examine the ground, tracing the rocks with his fingers, trying to imagine what had happened here. And that's when he saw it, something that had been missed during the initial search. A small jagged stone, stained with a dark, reddish hue. Blood. He stood quickly, scanning the area. But before he could investigate further, a sound broke the silence. It was faint, like a whisper carried on the wind, but unmistakable. A voice calling his name. He froze. It wasn't possible. He was alone, miles from any trail, yet the voice was clear and persistent. It echoed through the trees, pulling him in, urging him deeper into the forest. Against his better judgment, he followed, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice grew louder, more insistent. But no matter how far he walked, he saw nothing. Then, without warning, the voice stopped. Silence fell once more, and with it, the realization that he had ventured too far. The forest had grown denser, the trees taller, their branches blocking out the sky. He was disoriented, lost in a maze of towering pines and jagged rocks. Panic set in. He turned back, trying to retrace his steps, but the forest seemed to shift around him, the landscape unfamiliar and alien. Hours passed. Or maybe just minutes. He couldn't tell anymore. All he knew was that he needed to get out, and fast. Just as the last rays of sunlight began to disappear, he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. There, half buried in the snow, was a camera. A camera, old and weathered, but unmistakably the same model that Charles McCullar had carried with him. The ranger knelt down, his hands trembling as he picked it up. It was impossible. How had it ended up here, so far from where Charles's remains had been found? He turned the camera over in his hands, and as he did, a strange feeling washed over him. A sense of finality, of something ancient and powerful, watching him from the shadows. He stood, gripping the camera tightly, and without looking back, made his way out of the forest. When he returned to the park headquarters, he handed over the camera to his superiors, but he knew better than to press for answers. Some things, he realized, were never meant to be understood. And in the heart of Crater Lake, some mysteries would remain unsolved forever. To this day, no one knows what really happened to Charles McCullar. The forest keeps its secrets well.